Good evening, and welcome back. Get comfortable now. Pull the blanket up a little higher. Adjust the pillow. Feel how clean your sheets are. Feel how recently you bathed. Appreciate for just a moment the hot water that came out of a tap, the soap that smelled of something pleasant and deliberate, and the towel that was washed at some point this decade. Hold on to that feeling, because tonight we are leaving it behind. We are going to the Middle Ages, a world that smelled considerably worse than the one you currently occupy. A world where the gap between a person and their last bath was measured not in days but in seasons. Where the finest knights in Christendom went into battle smelling like a wet dog that had also been inside another wet dog. Where the most elegant ladies of the court managed their personal fragrance situation with rosewater and optimism in roughly equal measure. We are going to talk about how people smelled, what they did about it, what they did not do about it, and why, given everything, they were managing rather better than you might think, while simultaneously being considerably worse than you would prefer. This is not a story about ignorance. The people of the medieval world were not stupid. They were working with the tools available, the knowledge available, and the hot water available, which was, crucially, much less of it than you have right now. They had opinions about cleanliness, firm ones. Those opinions were held with tremendous confidence and were wrong in almost every direction simultaneously. So settle in, breathe through your mouth if you must, and let us begin. Let us start with the night, because the night is where the medieval hygiene story becomes most immediately and vividly terrible. Picture the knight as you know him from paintings and films, gleaming armour catching the light, a noble bearing, a war horse beneath him, equally magnificent, equally clean. The image is heroic, stirring, and almost entirely fictional in its relationship to the actual smell of an actual knight on an actual battlefield in the actual medieval period. The reality of a knight's existence was this. He was, for significant portions of his professional life, sealed inside a metal container with himself. Let us understand what that means in practice. A knight's armour in the late medieval period was an engineering marvel. Articulated joints, carefully fitted pieces, decades of craftsmanship poured into each suit. It was also, when worn for any significant length of time, an experience not unlike being zip-locked into a very expensive, very heavy bag of yourself. Before the armour went on, the knight would put on his arming doublet. This was a padded garment worn next to the skin, designed to prevent the metal from grinding directly against the body. It was quilted, it was thick, it was worn in summer, in wool. The arming doublet absorbed sweat. This was its purpose, in a practical sense, and it performed this purpose with tremendous dedication. It absorbed the sweat of training sessions, the sweat of previous battles, the sweat of the ride to the tournament in August, the sweat of the anxiety of the night before, lying in a tent wondering whether tomorrow is going to be one's last day. It absorbed all of it, and it held on to it, and it kept it. The arming doublet was not washed between every wearing. This would have been considered excessive. Fabric was expensive. Time was short. A knight on campaign did not have access to laundry facilities, and a certain seasoning in a garment was, by the standards of the time, entirely normal. After several weeks of continuous wear, the arming doublet had developed what we might diplomatically call a character. Less diplomatically, it smelled like a medieval knight had been wearing it for several weeks, which is exactly what had happened. Over the arming doublet went the chainmail. Thousands of interlocked metal rings, each one handcrafted, collectively forming a garment that was heavy, flexible, and, once you'd been sweating into it for any length of time, aromatic in a way that chainmail specifically tends to be, which is to say, metallic and damp, and very distinctly itself. Over the chainmail went the plate armour, piece by piece, greaves for the lower legs, polins for the knees, cuisses for the thighs, breastplate, backplate, pauldrons for the shoulders, vambraces over the forearms, gauntlets, helmet. The whole assembly required a squire to assist because putting on plate armour alone was an exercise in comedy and futility and the kind of contortionism that was not considered appropriate for a man of noble bearing. Once the armour was on, the knight was protected from swords and arrows and the general violence of medieval warfare. He was also sealed inside with approximately 12 layers of himself. Tournaments could last for hours. Battles could last for days. During sieges, which could last for months, knights might keep their armour on for extended periods, because removing it meant vulnerability, and removing it also meant a great deal of effort, and sometimes neither the time nor the safe location for that effort was available. So the armour stayed on. The knight stayed inside it. The smell stayed with both of them. When the armour finally came off, what emerged was a smell that historical accounts describe with a consistency that suggests it made an impression. Squires who assisted with the removal of battle armour were performing a service of considerable physical unpleasantness. They deserve, as a group, considerably more historical recognition than they receive. The armour itself was cleaned after battle, sand and vinegar for the metal, a bag of fine grit that the squire would roll the chainmail in, like a very unpleasant snack, to remove the rust and blood and general accumulation. The armour of a great lord might be worth more than an entire village, and it was cared for accordingly. Cleaned, oiled, polished, maintained with the obsessive attention that its value demanded. The man inside it was cleaned rather less obsessively. Bathing for a knight on campaign was a theoretical concept. Water had to be found or carried. Heating it required fire and time, and someone to manage both. Privacy in a military camp was not a feature of the experience, and there were other priorities: swords to sharpen, strategies to discuss, prayers to offer, the horse to see to, because a horse that was not properly cared for became useless, and a knight without a horse was just an expensively dressed person standing in a field. A knight who smelled was still a knight. The categories were different. So they managed. They wiped down with damp cloths when cloths and water were available. They changed their linen undergarments when linen was available, which was not always. They used herbs and perfumes, and whatever aromatic thing was to hand to address the more pressing aspects of the situation. Lavender in the bedding when there was bedding, herbs rubbed onto the skin, pomanders worn at the belt, small containers of aromatic substances that were believed to protect against disease and also happened to make the air immediately around one's person smell slightly more intentional. And then they put the armour back on and went back to work. The Knights of the Crusades had a particularly challenging time of this. The Middle East in summer is hot. Plate armour in the Middle East in summer, in the sun, is a way of cooking yourself inside a very expensive oven. The accounts of crusaders describe the heat inside armour as something close to unbearable. The sweating was constant. The opportunities for bathing were limited. The distance from home, where the good soap was approximately 2,000 miles, and yet they carried on, with the absolute confidence of people who did not have a reference point for what hot running water felt like, because it had not been invented yet. They were not stoically enduring something they knew was unpleasant. They were living in the conditions of their world, which was all anyone had ever done, and they thought nothing particular of it. This, in a sense, is the entire medieval hygiene story in miniature. Not neglect, not ignorance exactly. Just a different world, with different resources, and a remarkably confident approach to the gap between the world as it was and the world as it smelled. A small but illuminating detail of medieval life is that the knight's horse was almost certainly better groomed than the knight himself. This was not sentiment, it was economics. A war horse in the medieval period was worth a fortune. A fully trained destrier, the heavy war horse used in battle, might cost as much as a small estate. It represented years of training, considerable expense, and the difference between a knight being able to function as a knight and a knight being a very heavily armoured pedestrian. The horse was an investment, and investments were maintained. The grooms who cared for war horses brushed them daily, checked their hooves, cleaned their stables with an attention to the accumulation of waste that was notably more systematic than what was applied to the quarters occupied by the people who owned them, fed them carefully measured diets, monitored their health with something approaching modern anxiety. The horse was bathed regularly, with water that was carried specifically for that purpose. The knight, in the same period, was bathed when bathing was convenient. This was not hypocrisy, it was priorities expressed with complete clarity. The horse dying or going lame had immediate and catastrophic practical consequences. The knight smelling badly had social consequences that were manageable because everyone smelled badly, and therefore no one smelled badly in the sense of standing out from their environment. It was simply the smell of the environment. The squire who cared for the knight's armour spent more time on the armour than on its occupant. The armour was polished, the man was not. This was the correct order of things from a medieval perspective, and it was not considered strange. We might note that this is, in a certain light, a touching inversion of modern priorities. We clean ourselves constantly, and our cars occasionally. They clean the armour constantly, and the person occasionally. The principle of applying the most resources to the most valuable thing is the same. The determination of what was most valuable is where the medieval period and the modern period disagree. The stable itself was a model of relative cleanliness compared to many human spaces. Straw was changed more regularly than the rushes on a great hall floor, because a horse that stood in its own filth for too long developed foot problems, and foot problems in a horse were expensive, and expensive things were avoided. The smell of a well-maintained medieval stable was the smell of hay and horse and fresh straw and manure that had been removed at appropriate intervals. Not clean in any modern sense, but managed, intentionally managed. The knight who smelled like his horse was, in a way, in good company. While the knight was sweating inside his armour somewhere on a muddy French field, the ladies of the castle were engaged in their own complicated relationship with cleanliness. A relationship characterized by enormous effort, considerable sophistication, and a notably selective application of water. The medieval noblewoman was not, as popular imagination sometimes suggests, entirely indifferent to her personal presentation. She was, in fact, deeply invested in it. She simply invested in different parts of it than modern sensibilities would choose. The hair was attended to with extraordinary care, daily combing, regular application of oils and perfumes, elaborate arrangements that took hours to construct and required the assistance of skilled attendants. The hair of a noblewoman was her glory, her primary visual asset, the thing that poems were written about, and that was adorned with the most expensive and delicate accessories available. The hair was washed considerably less frequently than it was arranged. Washing the hair required washing all of it. This meant quantities of hot water, which required heating, which required fire, which required fuel and time. A medieval castle was not known for its warmth, and the process of drying long hair in a draughty stone building could take hours. During those hours, one was vulnerable to catching a chill, which in a medieval medical understanding was a serious matter with potentially fatal consequences. And so a compromise was reached, which is the compromise that medieval noblewomen almost universally reached. The hair was combed and oiled and perfumed and arranged with enormous skill and attention, and it was washed when the occasion specifically warranted it and the conditions specifically permitted it. The occasion warranted it less often than you might hope. The conditions permitted it less often than you might prefer. In between washings, the hair accumulated, oils accumulated, the products applied to it accumulated. The fine-toothed comb removed some of this, along with the head lice, which we will discuss shortly, because they deserve their own section, and have certainly earned it. But the hair of a medieval noblewoman, however beautifully arranged, was operating under conditions that would cause a modern hairdresser to ask some questions. The smell of a noblewoman's elaborately arranged hair was distinctive, not unpleasant necessarily, to the people of the time who had reference points calibrated to the world they lived in. It smelled of the oils applied to it, the perfumes worked through it, the pomades and preparations of the period, some of which were genuinely sophisticated and some of which were genuinely alarming. It smelled of a world before shampoo. The skin received more attention than the hair in terms of washing. The face and hands were washed daily. This was a social expectation and a practical one. The face was visible. The hands touched food and other people, and were the primary instrument of interaction with the world. Keeping them clean was understood to be important, even if the specific reasons for that importance were not yet fully articulated. The rest of the body was attended to as circumstances allowed, which was not every day, which was sometimes not every week. Between the face and hands and the full body bath, there were washcloths and basins and the application of damp cloths to the relevant areas, and this was managed with the same pragmatic competence that characterized the medieval approach to everything that required doing with inadequate resources. The bath, when it occurred, was a production of considerable complexity. A wooden tub had to be brought to the private chamber. Water had to be heated in the kitchens, which were located at some distance from the private chambers, partly for safety reasons and partly because medieval castle architects were not particularly focused on the convenience of hot water delivery. The heated water then had to be carried upstairs in buckets, which was the work of servants, which required having servants, which was one of the luxuries of rank. Into the tub went herbs, flowers when flowers were available, oils, the preparations that made the experience pleasant enough to justify the considerable effort of assembling it. The bath was, when it happened, a genuine luxury, and it was treated as one. It was not a quick shower, it was an event. After the bath, the noble woman smelled wonderful, for a while. The medieval world being what it was, this did not last as long as it might, and then the process of management resumed, and the perfumes went back on, and the arrangement of the hair was attended to, and the whole fragrant construction that constituted a noblewoman's personal presentation was rebuilt and maintained until the next occasion warranted a bath. Perfume was not, in this context, a luxury. It was a necessity. The strong floral and herbal scents that noblewomen wore served a practical function that everyone understood without anyone needing to say it explicitly. You did not wear perfume because you liked it, although you might also like it. You wore it because you were managing a situation, and the situation required management. The wardrobe itself was a managed environment. Clothing was stored with lavender and cedar, and whatever other fragrant substances were available, because clothing stored in a chest acquired the smell of what it was stored with, and it was preferable that this be lavender rather than the available alternatives. When the clothing was taken out and worn, it smelled of lavender, which was pleasant, and of the person wearing it, which was managed. The gloves of a noblewoman were sometimes perfumed on the inside. This was a practice that emerged from a clear understanding of the situation and a creative response to it. If one could not fully address the underlying condition, one could address the immediate vicinity of one's hands, and perfumed gloves ensured that the hands smelled of something intentional, which was the goal. Let us talk about head lice, because they deserve to be talked about, and because they are one of the most illuminating and most democratically distributed features of medieval hygiene. Everyone had head lice. This is not an exaggeration. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites across Europe, from the humblest peasant cottages to the grandest castle bedchambers, shows lice and their eggs present in the combs, the bedding, the fabric, the hair of everyone who lived in those spaces. This was not a problem of the poor or the unwashed. This was a feature of medieval life that the wealthy and the poor, the clean and the less clean, the knight and the beggar shared with absolute equality. Head lice are extraordinarily well adapted to living in human hair. They have been living in human hair for as long as humans have had hair, and in that time they have developed a mastery of their environment that is, from a purely biological perspective, impressive. They are small, they move quickly, they grip the hair shaft with a tenacity that defies casual removal. They reproduce at a rate that ensures the next generation is always ready to replace whatever the comb has managed to dislodge. They spread through contact. The same bed, the same comb, the same chair back, the same pillow. Medieval people shared beds routinely, shared combs frequently, lived in close quarters constantly, and the head lice moved between them with complete freedom, appreciating the excellent infrastructure provided by medieval social arrangements. The fine-toothed comb was the primary defence, and the fine-toothed combs of the medieval period were beautiful things. Ivory for the wealthy, bone for those of more modest means, boxwood which was considered particularly good for the purpose, sometimes carved and decorated, sometimes fitted with cases. A good comb was a valued possession, kept close, used daily, and bequeathed to children in wills with the seriousness appropriate to a genuinely useful object. The comb was effective, within limits. Running a fine-toothed comb through the hair removed lice and their eggs with some reliability. Medieval people understood this and practiced it with the daily dedication that the problem required. This was not a weekly chore. This was a daily ritual, as routine as face washing, as expected as prayer, as inescapable as the lice themselves. Various other preparations were also brought to bear on the problem. Herbal preparations, some of which had genuine insecticidal properties and actually worked. Substances like pig fat applied to the hair and then combed out, on the theory that the fat would make it easier to slide the lice off the hair shaft, which has a certain mechanical logic and may have been partially effective. Preparations involving mercury, which definitely killed the lice and also had a range of additional effects on the person whose head it was applied to, not all of them welcome. There were preparations involving substances whose composition made modern readers wince. Ancient physicians had prescribed certain things for head lice, and ancient physicians were authoritative, and their authority did not expire simply because germ theory had not yet arrived to interrogate their methods. If Galen had recommended a particular preparation, it was used, and whether Galen had been entirely correct about everything was not a question that was asked very loudly. The head covering that married women in much of medieval Europe wore in public served, among its many functions, a practical role in the management of the lice situation. Hair covered was hair that was less accessible to the casual passing louse seeking a new home. It also meant that the arrangement of the hair underneath the covering was less exposed to the scrutiny of the world, which was convenient on days when the arrangement was more practical than elegant. The medieval barber who attended to men's hair spent a significant portion of his professional time on this problem, running the fine-toothed comb through hair, applying the preparations, managing the ongoing situation with the calm efficiency of someone for whom this was simply the professional context in which work was done. The barber's shop was, among other things, a lice management facility, and this was understood by everyone who used it. The fleas, of course, were an additional feature of medieval life. Not head lice, which confined themselves to hair, but body fleas, which were considerably less selective about their habitat. They lived in bedding, in clothing, in the rushes on the floor, in the fur linings of garments, in the spaces between the stones of castle walls, where warmth accumulated. They bit. They moved from person to person, and from person to animal with the easy familiarity of creatures who regarded the entire medieval world as their personal habitat, which it essentially was. The medieval approach to fleas was a mixture of practical management and resigned acceptance. Bedding could be shaken, clothing could be beaten, the rushes on the floor could eventually be replaced, though the question of how often they were replaced is one of the sadder statistical inquiries of medieval history. Special flea traps existed, small devices of fur or cloth designed to attract and capture fleas, which suggests that the medieval mind was engaged with this problem and attempting to solve it with the resources available. The resources available were, it must be said, limited, and the fleas, who had been doing this for considerably longer than humanity had been trying to stop them, were well ahead in the negotiation. The floor of the medieval Great Hall was covered in rushes. This is perhaps the detail of medieval interior design that most rewards close attention, because the rushes were not just floor covering. They were, over time, an entire ecosystem. Rushes are a type of marsh grass. They were cut, dried and spread across the stone floors of great halls as insulation against the cold of the stone, as cushioning against the hardness of the stone, and as a surface that was at least soft enough to sit on, which the stone itself was not. Fresh rushes smelled clean and green. They were pleasant. They were the medieval equivalent of a nice new carpet, and for approximately the first week of their existence on the floor, they functioned as one. After the first week, the process began. Dogs were present in great halls constantly. This was not considered unusual. Dogs were working animals, hunters and guards and companions, and they lived with their owners in the spaces where their owners lived, which was the Great Hall. Dogs eat. Dogs contribute to the floor. Dogs carry things in and drop them in the rushes, and sometimes go back for them, and sometimes do not. Dogs are dogs, with all the habits that implies, and the rushes received the full benefit of their presence. Food scraps fell from the table. Medieval eating involved a certain amount of what might diplomatically be called enthusiasm, and the rushes caught what fell. Bones dropped and were retrieved by dogs and dropped again. Wine was spilled. Ale was spilled. Various sauces made contact with the rushes and stayed there. The rushes were not washed. The rushes absorbed. Over time, the rushes at the bottom of the layer decomposed, becoming a kind of compressed medieval record of everything that had happened in the Great Hall since the last time the rushes were changed. A geological stratum of domestic life. Food scraps from last Tuesday, bones from the feast a month ago, the wine from the celebratory evening 3 weeks past, the general biological contributions of a large number of people and animals living in close proximity. The rushes were changed, eventually. The historical evidence on this point is not encouraging. Erasmus of Rotterdam, a scholar of the early 16th century, who was considerably less diplomatic than his reputation might suggest, visited England and was moved to write about the English practice of laying rushes on floors. He was not complimentary. He described what he found at the bottom of the accumulated layers in terms that suggested decades of material, which may be an exaggeration, but is certainly an impression formed by close proximity. Some households understood the problem and addressed it with the tools available. Fresh herbs were mixed into the rushes. Lavender and rosemary and sweet-smelling things were strewn about on top of the existing rushes, both to add pleasantness and to mask the lack of it in the layers beneath. This was approximately as effective as putting air freshener in a room that needs structural remediation, but it was the available technology, and it was applied with genuine intent. The rushes were also home to a range of small creatures that found them congenial. Fleas, as mentioned, beetles of various descriptions. The small creatures that live wherever organic material is decomposing. which in the rushes was a great deal of organic material. Medieval people shared their floor with these creatures in the same way they shared their beds with them, which is to say that they were aware of them, managed them imperfectly, and proceeded with their lives regardless. The smell of the great hall rushes was distinctive, not necessarily unpleasant to the people who lived with it constantly, because the nose habituates and what is always present becomes background. But to a visitor arriving from outside, fresh to the experience, the smell of a well-used great hall in winter was an immediate and comprehensive sensory experience that stayed with the visitor long after they had departed. Herbs helped somewhat. They did not solve the underlying problem, which was that the floor was a repository for everything and was cleaned irregularly. But they helped somewhat, and somewhat was what was available, so somewhat was what was deployed. The noblewoman who instructed her servants to strew fresh rosemary among the rushes was making a genuine effort within the constraints of her world, and she deserves credit for the intention, if not for the outcome. The medieval bed was, by modern standards, a remarkable social institution. It was not a private space. It was, in many households, a shared resource of some flexibility, and what shared it with you on any given night depended on your household, your season, your social circumstances, and a range of factors that had nothing to do with personal preference. Sharing a bed was normal. Sharing a bed with strangers was normal if you were staying at an inn and the inn was full, which inns frequently were. Sharing a bed with family members was normal in smaller households where beds were limited. Sharing a bed with the servants was not unusual in some contexts. Sharing a bed with the family pig in peasant households during winter was a practical decision about keeping warm rather than a statement about one's views on the boundary between domestic and animal space. The pig is worth a moment's consideration. Pigs were warm. They generated heat with the comfortable efficiency of animals who eat a great deal and have considerable body mass. In winter, in a peasant cottage that was cold, the presence of the pig in the sleeping space was a genuine contribution to the temperature of the room. The pig was not there because anyone particularly wanted the pig there. The pig was there because the pig represented a significant financial investment and the cold was dangerous to it. And also because the pig was warm, and warmth was valuable. The smell of the medieval bedroom in winter was, in peasant households at least, a complex mixture. Wood smoke, which came from the fire that was the primary source of both heat and light, and which filled the room with a haze that was accepted as normal. Bodies unwashed to varying degrees, in various states of sleep. Animal warmth, if the pig or other animals were present. The rushes on the floor, the straw in the mattress which was renewed periodically, and was, when new, pleasant, and when old, less so. The wool of the bedding, which absorbed the smell of everything it came into contact with, and held it with the dedication of a material that was expensive, and therefore not washed frequently. The straw mattress deserves particular attention. Medieval mattresses were stuffed with straw, or with wool, or with feathers for the wealthy, and they sat in wooden frames that were themselves not particularly hygienic. The straw absorbed sweat. It absorbed the smell of the bodies that slept on it night after night. Over time, the straw compressed and began to decompose, slowly, providing a substrate that various small creatures found congenial for the same reasons that the floor rushes did. The bed was shaken, the mattress was periodically restuffed, the bedding was washed sometimes in the batch laundry that happened on whatever schedule the household managed. Fresh herbs were put into the bedding, lavender particularly, for both the smell and the alleged insect-repelling properties. None of this fully addressed the reality of sleeping on a straw mattress in a medieval bedroom, but it was management, and management was the word. The wealthy had rather better beds. Feather mattresses were soft and comfortable, and did not decompose in the same way straw did. The bedding of the noble household was washed more regularly because there were more servants to wash it. The bedding was also more elaborate, with layers of linen and wool, and sometimes silk, all of which required different care, and all of which were maintained with the seriousness appropriate to expensive things. But the wealthy also shared their beds with their attendants, and their chambers were often adjacent to other chambers, and the medieval sense of privacy was considerably less developed than the modern one, and the night in a castle was full of sounds and smells, and the general proximity of a large number of people in a relatively small space. Sleep in the medieval period was also structured differently than modern sleep. People slept in 2 shifts, often waking in the middle of the night for a period of quiet wakefulness, prayer or conversation, and then sleeping again until morning. During this waking period in the middle of the night, people stayed in bed in the dark, in the company of whoever shared their sleeping space, and they talked or prayed or lay quietly, and then they went back to sleep. The bed in this context was a rather more central feature of life than the modern bedroom suggests. It was where you slept and woke and slept again. It was where you were ill. It was where you received visitors if you were of sufficient rank that receiving visitors in bed was appropriate. It was where you died if you were fortunate enough to have a bed to die in. It was, in a sense, the primary domestic space, and its condition was, in the circumstances, what it was. We cannot have a complete account of medieval hygiene without addressing the garderobe at proper length. We have touched on it. We must now dwell in it briefly, because it is central to the story, and because it illustrates something important about the medieval relationship between the body and its various requirements. The garderobe was the medieval toilet. In a castle, it was typically a small room built into the thickness of the wall, or jutting out from it as a small projection, with a stone seat, a hole in the stone seat, and a shaft that led from the hole to somewhere else. The somewhere else was the crucial variable. In some castles, the shaft led directly to the outside of the castle wall, depositing the contents onto the ground below. This was simple and effective, and created, over time, a notable feature on that particular side of the castle that visitors arriving from that direction would immediately be aware of. In other castles, the shaft led to a cesspit beneath the castle, which accumulated the contributions of all the guardrobes connected to it and required periodic attention. The attention was provided by a specific profession whose members were called, in various historical records, gongfirmers or rakers, or by a number of other terms that polite historical writing tends to approach with some circumspection. The gongfirmers were the people who emptied the cesspits. They worked at night, which was a practical arrangement on multiple levels. The temperatures were lower, the foot traffic was reduced, The number of people who needed to witness what was happening was minimized. They used buckets and shovels and the accumulated professional knowledge of people who had been doing this work for long enough to have developed efficient methods. They were paid, sometimes paid quite well relative to the other labourers of the period. The wage reflected the nature of the work, and the nature of the work was such that the wage needed to reflect it meaningfully to attract anyone willing to do it. This was supply and demand in one of its more vivid expressions. The contents of the cesspit were then taken somewhere. In agricultural areas they were used as fertiliser, which is entirely sensible and continues as a practice in modern agriculture with appropriate processing. In cities they were carted to designated dumping areas outside the city walls, which worked better in theory than in practice, as the designated areas had a tendency to fill up and the carts had a tendency to leak. The smell from the guardrobe travelled. Stone is porous. The shafts were not sealed. The smell moved through the wall and into the spaces adjacent to it. Guardrobes were therefore positioned with some care, away from the main living areas, when the layout permitted, in corners and alcoves where the smell could be somewhat contained, or at least directed toward the least inhabited part of the castle. There is a historical detail so perfectly medieval in its logic that it must be mentioned. Wardrobes were often positioned near guardrobes. The theory was that the fumes rising from the shaft below would keep moths away from the clothing stored in the wardrobe. The moth deterrent theory of castle interior design. Whether it worked as moth prevention is unknown. Whether the clothing absorbed the character of its storage location is perhaps not a question we need to answer directly. The castle moat in many cases received contributions from the garderobes on the walls above. The romantic image of the moat as a picturesque water feature surrounding the castle is somewhat revised by the historical evidence of what the moat contained, which was everything the castle produced that needed to go somewhere. The moat was many things. Clean was not consistently among them. In towns and cities, the situation was managed with varying degrees of success. Chamber pots were used indoors, and their contents were supposed to be disposed of in specified ways. The specified ways were not always followed. The window of a medieval city building, opened in the morning, was an action that required some awareness of what might be coming from the windows above, and some caution about the ground below. There were rules. Medieval cities were not anarchic about this. Ordinances specified where waste could be disposed of, who was responsible for maintaining cesspits, where the gong firmers were to take what they collected. The existence of the ordinances tells you that the underlying behaviour they were trying to regulate was persistent enough to require ongoing legal attention. Rules that are universally followed do not need to be repeated. Medieval sanitation ordinances were repeated. The medieval city street was a multi-purpose space. It was a path for walking, a market, a place of work, a venue for social interaction, and, with a practical directness that the modern city has mostly abandoned, it was where things went when they needed to go somewhere. The gutter that ran down the centre or side of the medieval city street was not just for rainwater. It received the contributions of the households on either side, the wastewater from cooking and washing, the contents of chamber pots emptied from upper windows, the runoff from the butchers and fishmongers and other trades whose work generated liquid waste of various characters. The gutter carried all of this toward the nearest river, or the nearest low point, or wherever gravity decided it should go. Walking in a medieval city required a certain attention to your surroundings and a certain willingness to observe where you are putting your feet. The raised step at the entrance to buildings was not purely decorative. It was a practical measure, a small elevation above the level of the street that kept the worst of the street's contents from entering the building directly. The pigs were part of the urban landscape in ways that medieval city governments repeatedly attempted to regulate and repeatedly found difficult to enforce. Pigs were useful. They ate waste. They could be kept in small spaces. They produced meat and fat and leather and the various things that pigs produce. They were also pigs with the behavioural habits and the roaming tendencies and the complete indifference to city ordinances that pigs are known for. Medieval cities passed rules about pigs. The pigs, unaware of the regulatory environment, continue to do what pigs do. The rules were passed again, with greater specificity. The pigs continued to be pigs. The humans continued to keep pigs in the city because pigs were too useful to give up, and the street continued to receive the consequences of this decision. The tanneries were another significant contributor to the urban smell. Tanning leather was a necessary industry. Leather was used for everything from shoes to armour, to the straps that held the armour together, to the bags that carried things to the saddles, that horses wore to the bellows, that worked the fires. Leather was everywhere, and it was produced through a process that was, to put it charitably, pungent. The tanning process began with the hides, which arrived from the slaughterhouse still redolent of their recent past. The hides were soaked in urine. Urine was collected for this purpose. People contributed to this collection. The urine loosened the hair and began the softening process. The hides then went through various additional baths of progressively less alarming substances, including the tannin-rich bark of oak trees, which is where the process gets its name, until something recognisable as leather emerged at the other end. Medieval cities understood that tanneries should ideally be downwind and downstream of the main residential areas. They had not developed modern zoning in any formal sense, but the principle of putting the smelly industries at a distance from the places where people lived was one that urban experience had taught them, and the better organised medieval cities applied it, imperfectly but sincerely. Not all medieval cities were particularly well organised about this, and even in the cities that were, the wind changed direction, and the river had its own ideas about flow, and the tanneries ended up contributing to the general olfactory environment regardless of where they had been placed. The slaughterhouses were adjacent to the tanneries in terms of smell and waste. Animals came in, meat and hide and tallow and offal came out. The blood and waste of the slaughtering process had to go to somewhere, and where it went was not always the designated location. The designated location was frequently a river, and the medieval river, in or near a city, was by any modern measure receiving a great deal of attention from many different contributors. There were flowers in the medieval city, and herbs, and bread baking, which is one of the genuinely lovely smells that the medieval period and the modern period share, and spices and incense from churches, and the exotic goods from the market stalls that sold things from far away. The medieval city was not a uniform and unrelenting assault. It was a mixture, some of it genuinely pleasant, some of it genuinely not, all of it continuously present. The people who lived there stopped noticing most of it, because that is what noses do. They habituate. What is always present becomes background. The travellers from outside who wrote about the smell of medieval cities were experiencing it fresh, with noses that had not adjusted, and their descriptions tend toward the emphatic. The people who lived there were simply living their lives, in the smell of those lives, unremarkably. The great hall at dinner was medieval life at its most social, and from a modern perspective, its most hygienically interesting. A large number of people, shared food, common vessels, animals in attendance, rushes on the floor. The whole managed according to an elaborate system of manners that addressed some aspects of the situation and declined to notice others. Medieval table manners were real and elaborate and taken seriously. There were rules about how to eat, how to present oneself at table, how to behave in the presence of one's lord or one's betters or one's equals. Books were written about this. Children were educated in it. A person who could not behave correctly at table was a person who could not be trusted in polite society. The rules addressed washing hands before eating, which was a genuine requirement and was executed with ceremony, with a servant bringing a basin and water and a towel, and the washing being performed visibly as a statement of one's intention to eat properly. This was not just hygiene, it was theatre. It demonstrated that you were the kind of person who washed your hands before eating, which was a person of appropriate standing and good manners. The rules also addressed how food was taken from the common dishes, how to wipe one's hands on the tablecloth rather than on one's clothes, which tells you something about the state of the tablecloth by the end of the meal. How to drink from a shared cup with appropriate decorum, which tells you that cups were shared, which they were. How to handle bones, which is to say that bones were handled, which they were, with the hands, and the dogs were there to receive them when the handling was done. The dogs were under the table throughout. This was normal. Dogs were part of the domestic scene, and the great hall at dinner was a domestic scene, and the dogs were present with the comfort of creatures who belonged there, which they did. They ate the scraps that fell, or were thrown, or were offered, or were left on the rushes. They contributed to the rushes in the way that dogs contribute to floors. They moved among the feet of the diners with the confidence of animals who knew their place, which was everywhere. Spitting was acceptable. The toothpick was used at table. Blowing the nose into the fingers and then wiping the fingers on something nearby was a behaviour that the more advanced books of manners suggested doing with some discretion, which implies that it was being done without discretion often enough to require a note about it. Food was shared. Trenchers, which were slabs of bread used as plates, absorbed the juices of the food placed on them, and were then either eaten or given to the poor outside, who were grateful for them. The trencher was personal in the sense that it belonged to the person eating from it, but it was shared at its edges with whatever the person next to you was eating from theirs, because the medieval table was not a wide-spaced arrangement. The spoons were shared, the cups were shared, the salt was shared from a common container that everyone at the table reached into. The bread baskets circulated, the common dishes circulated. Medieval dining was a communal activity in a way that went considerably further than the modern buffet. The hands that reached into those common dishes and salt containers and bread baskets were hands that had been washed before dinner, which is something. Whether they had been washed at any other point during the day, and what they had touched between that washing and this meal, was not a question the social system was designed to ask. Let us speak directly about the smell of the medieval human body, which is the thing that underlies all of this and which deserves to be addressed with the same directness that the medieval period itself might have appreciated, which is to say, a direct acknowledgement followed by an immediate discussion of what one does about it. The medieval body smelled. This is not a judgment, it is a description of the inevitable consequence of a body that bathed infrequently in a climate that was cold, and a world that had not yet developed the infrastructure of odour management that modern people rely on without thinking about. The hair, as we've discussed, accumulated. The skin accumulated sweat, and the products of ordinary life without being washed away daily. The clothing accumulated the smell of the body inside it, because clothing worn for extended periods becomes, over time, a record of those periods. The feet enclosed in leather shoes or boots, in wool stockings, in the warm, dark environment that feet generate became a particular feature of the overall experience. The feet of the medieval person deserve a paragraph of their own. The shoe of the period was leather that had been tanned, which we know was not an entirely neutral smelling process, leather that was worn day after day without the benefit of the airing that modern shoes receive, because medieval people had fewer shoes and could not afford to rest them on alternate days in the way that shoe care guides recommend. Inside the leather shoe was a wool stocking. Inside the wool stocking was a foot. The foot sweated, as feet do, and the sweat was absorbed by the stocking, and the stocking held it, and the shoe held both of them. And by the end of a day of work or travel, or simply walking around a medieval city, the situation inside the shoe was distinctive. Medieval people were not unaware of this. They were managing it with the tools available, which were primarily aromatic, perfumes, herbs, the application of fragrant things to cover or compete with the less fragrant things. This was not deception, it was the available technology, and it was deployed with considerable sophistication. The pomander, a small container of aromatic substances worn at the belt or carried in the hand, was a daily tool for the person of any means. It provided a constant source of pleasant smell near the nose, which helped. It was also believed to provide protection against the bad air that was thought to cause disease, which gave it a medical as well as a cosmetic rationale. The herbs in the clothing, lavender in particular, served multiple functions. They smelled pleasant. They were believed to repel insects, with some justification in the case of certain herbs. They indicated that one was the kind of person who managed these things, which was a social statement as well as a practical one. The shoes of the wealthy were sometimes perfumed, the inside treated with aromatic preparations that address the foot situation from within. This is a detail that is both entirely medieval and entirely understandable, and it speaks well of the medieval mind that it arrived at this solution. But the underlying reality remained. The medieval body, going about its medieval life, was operating in a world that had not yet developed the means to address what it was doing, and the medieval nose, calibrated to the medieval world, experienced this as normal, because it was normal. The reference point was not cleanliness, as we understand it. The reference point was the world they lived in, and they lived in it entirely. The evening in a noble household was a gradual retreat from the public world into the private one, and the smells changed with the transition. The great hall in the evening, after the dinner had been cleared and the dogs had finished their portion of the rushes and the candles had been lit, had a particular character. The smell of food lingered. The candles added their own contribution, which was tallow, rendered animal fat, which burned with a smell that was warm and somewhat meaty and entirely normal to the people who sat beneath it. Beeswax candles, which were more expensive, burned more cleanly and were available to the wealthier households. But the tallow candle was the workhorse of medieval illumination, and it smelled like one. The fire, which was the centre of warmth and the focus of the hall, burned wood. The wood smoke worked its way through the hall, through the clothing of the people in it, into the hair and the fabric and the spaces between things. Everything in a medieval hall smelled of wood smoke to some degree, which is such a universal and constant smell that it registered as simply the smell of being inside a building. Visitors from outside noticed it. The inhabitants did not. The rushlights that supplemented the candles in less wealthy households were made from the pith of rushes soaked in animal fat, and they burned with the smell that was a concentrated version of what the tallow candle produced. Efficient, if efficiency is measured by the production of light per unit of smell. As the evening progressed and the household retired, the sleeping spaces were prepared. Beds were warmed with a warming pan, a covered metal container filled with coals, run between the sheets to take the chill off the linen. The linen smelled of the chest it had been stored in, which smelled of the herbs placed there to manage the moths. The herbs were pleasant. The underlying smell of fabric that had been in a chest for some time, and before that on someone's body, was a more complicated matter. The chamber pot was positioned. The chamber pot, in use overnight, contributed its own element to the aromatic environment of the sleeping chamber. The ladies' attendants who were sleeping nearby, because noble ladies did not sleep without attendants, were aware of this. Everyone was aware of this. It was simply the way nights worked. By morning, the sleeping chamber had developed, through the honest efforts of its various occupants and their various biological requirements, a smell that was rich and human and entirely authentic to the medieval experience. The shutters were opened. Air moved through the room. The chamber pot was removed and its contents dealt with. The bed was made. The day began. Medieval monasteries present an interesting contrast to the general pattern of medieval hygiene, because monasteries had something that most of the medieval world lacked: written rules, actual documented requirements about what to wash, when to wash it, and who was responsible for ensuring it was washed. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed the lives of Benedictine monks and influenced virtually every subsequent monastic tradition in the medieval West, addressed bathing. It said that monks might bathe as often as was useful, with the sick being granted more frequent baths and the healthy being granted fewer, particularly in winter. This is not, strictly speaking, an endorsement of bathing as a regular practice. It is a moderate position that acknowledges that bathing is sometimes appropriate, while not being excessively enthusiastic about it. But the monastery had something the secular world often lacked, which was infrastructure. Monasteries were the most sophisticated institutions in medieval Europe in terms of water management. They built elaborate systems to bring water to where it was needed. Running water, in the engineering sense of water moving through pipes and channels, under its own pressure or with modest assistance, was a feature of the better appointed monasteries long before it was a feature of secular buildings. This meant that the lavatory, the wash basin in the cloister, where monks washed their hands before meals, and certain liturgical acts, had water available in it. The latrines, the reredota, were positioned over a water channel that flushed them. The kitchen had access to running water. The infirmary, where sick monks were cared for, had better facilities than the average secular space. The result was a hygiene standard that was, probably, somewhat above the general population, achieved not through any particular medical understanding of why cleanliness mattered, but through institutional discipline that required it. You washed your hands before meals because the rule said to. The rule said to for religious reasons. The practical effect was that your hands were cleaner than they might otherwise have been. The monks also had scheduled laundry. Clean habits, the robes they wore, were provided at specified intervals. The schedule varied by house and season, but the principle that clothing should be washed on a defined schedule rather than washed when it occurred to someone was a genuinely significant organisational achievement. The monk whose robe was washed every 2 weeks was, statistically, wearing cleaner clothing than the nobleman whose outer garments were washed when they became unavoidably necessary to wash, which was a less frequent event. The herb garden that virtually every monastery maintained was both a contemplative space and a working pharmacopoeia. Plants with genuine medicinal and hygienic properties were cultivated alongside more purely spiritual or culinary plants. The monks who tended the garden developed real botanical knowledge about what plants did what, and some of that knowledge was correct. The peasant's hygiene situation was shaped by a single governing fact. Almost everything that hygiene required was difficult to obtain. Water was not piped. It came from wells or streams, and getting it required going to it and carrying it back, and heating it required fire, which required fuel, which required effort. This did not mean peasants were not clean. The persistent image of the universally filthy medieval peasant is, like most universal images of large groups of people, considerably more complicated than it appears. People wash their hands before eating because they ate with their hands, and the connection between dirty hands and a bad meal was direct and obvious. People wash their faces because faces are visible, and a dirty face is uncomfortable and socially noticed. People wash the parts of themselves that were uncomfortable when unwashed, because discomfort is a powerful motivator, regardless of the century you inhabit. The river was important. Communities near water had access to bathing that communities without did not. In summer, when the water was warm enough to make the experience bearable, and the work of the fields meant the need was pressing, a dip in the river or stream was both relief and cleaning. It was not clinical hygiene in any modern sense. It was doing what was available with what was available. The clothing of a peasant was simple and was worn for extended periods. Working clothes were worn, sweated into, aired on the hedge or the fence or the stone wall and worn again. The better clothes, kept for church and significant occasions, were maintained with more care because they were more valuable and irreplaceable. Everything was managed because management was the only option. The kitchen garden served purposes beyond food. The herbs grown there addressed the smell of indoor life in winter, when the peasant household was a closed space, shared by everyone who lived there, sometimes including the livestock. Lavender in the sleeping area, rosemary on the fire, herbs mixed into the floor covering to provide some competition for the smell of everything else. This was not primitive. This was sophisticated management of a difficult situation with the resources available. The peasant who maintained a productive herb garden, who knew which plants helped with which problems, who managed the overlapping demands of food and warmth and cleanliness and health with limited resources, was demonstrating a practical competence that deserves more credit than it typically receives. The smell of a peasant cottage in winter was its own particular experience. The fire in the centre, the smoke finding its way out as best it could, the animals nearby, the family asleep in their various arrangements, the herbs on the rafters, the dried food hanging alongside them, the earthen floor, the thatch above. It was warm and smoky and human, and entirely the smell of a life being lived in the conditions available, with everything that implies. The wealthy of the medieval world smelled better than the poor. This is true with qualifications, and the qualifications are interesting. They smelled better because they had access to more and better aromatic management, better perfumes, more of them, more frequent access to the experience of a bath, because they had servants to heat the water and carry it and fill the tub and dispose of it afterward. Better quality soap, if soap was used. Better quality clothing, maintained with more care. Better herbs and preparations for the management of the various aspects of medieval personal presentation. But they were working against the same underlying physics as everyone else. A body that is not washed for a week accumulates in the same way, regardless of the rank of the person inside it. The wool they wore absorbed sweat in exactly the same way that the wool worn by their tenants did. The shared bed and the shared cup and the shared social world meant that the isolating effect of wealth was, in terms of hygiene, incomplete. The wealthy also had access to the finer aromatic substances. Musk, which is expensive, which is obtained from the gland of a male musk deer at some distance from Europe, which had to be transported across considerable geography, and which had a smell that medieval people found appealing in the same way that modern people find certain things appealing that take some getting used to. Ambergris, which is a substance from the digestive system of sperm whales, and which is found floating in the ocean, and which cost a remarkable amount of money. Rose water, which was the relatively democratic option, and was used by anyone who could afford it at all. The wealthy wore perfume as a constant companion, the pomander at the belt, the scented gloves, the perfumed clothes stored in chests with lavender and cedar, and the other substances that managed both the smell of the clothing and the moth problem simultaneously. The scented handkerchief that was held to the nose when circumstances required it, which in the medieval city was frequently. The result was that a wealthy person smelled expensive. This is slightly different from smelling clean. It is smelling like someone who has spent money on the problem. And in the medieval world, as in many subsequent periods, the smell of money was considered an adequate substitute for the smell of cleanliness when cleanliness was not fully available. The laundry of the medieval period was one of the most demanding physical tasks in a world full of demanding physical tasks, and it was done without running water, without machines, without the mild detergents of the modern era, without any of the infrastructure that makes modern laundry feel effortless by comparison. The water had to be carried from the well or the stream to the place where the laundry was being done, in buckets by people, repeatedly. Enough water for the laundry of a household of any size meant a significant number of trips. The water had to be heated over a fire, in large pots or cauldrons. Heating water in large quantities over an open fire is a slow process, and keeping it hot enough while the washing was being done required managing the fire continuously. The washing was done with lye. Lye is made from wood ash soaked in water. It is an alkali. It is genuinely effective as a cleaning agent. It is also caustic. It strips oils from fabric and from skin with thoroughness and without particular discrimination about whether you intended it to strip that specific skin. The hands of people who did laundry regularly for a living were recognizable by the condition of those hands, which were rough and often cracked and sometimes raw. The fabric was pounded with wooden paddles or rocks or whatever implement was appropriate to the fabric and the location. The pounding worked the lye and water through the fabric, loosening and removing the accumulated grime, sweat, and other substances that fabric collects over its period of use. It was vigorous physical work. It was done by people for whom it was simply a feature of the week. The fabric was rinsed in water that had to be carried repeatedly, because lye left in fabric continues to affect it, and the rinse water needed to run clear before the process was complete. The fabric was dried, outside when the weather permitted, inside when it did not. The drying of large quantities of laundry inside a medieval building in winter was an exercise in patience and mild mildew, as the damp fabric occupied the warm spaces near the fire and created a domestic atmosphere that was warm and damp simultaneously, which is its own particular smell. Laundry was done in batches, not daily, monthly for many households, or seasonally for the heavier items. Linen could be washed more often because linen is a robust fabric that survives washing better than wool. Wool required careful handling, gentle temperature, slow drying, and the knowledge of how to do all of these things without destroying a fabric that was expensive and irreplaceable. The outer garments that could not be easily washed were not washed. They were aired and beaten and brushed and spot cleaned and treated with herbs and perfumes, and maintained in the best condition achievable without putting them through the washing process that would have damaged them. They wore these garments for extended periods in the understanding that the garments were an investment, and the investment was not to be risked in water. A noblewoman's best gown might be worn at a feast and then carefully brushed and aired and stored, and worn again at the next feast and stored again, accumulating over months the evidence of its various outings. The gown was valuable. The gown was maintained. The gown carried in its fibres a record of every occasion it had attended, which was visible in one way and perceptible in another. Medieval hair management was a project of considerable complexity, daily effort, and imperfect results. This was true for men and women across most of the social spectrum, though the specifics varied significantly by rank, by gender, and by the resources available for the project. For noble women, the hair was a primary indicator of status and beauty, and it received attention proportionate to that importance. The combing was daily, thorough, and performed by attendants who were skilled at both the practical and the aesthetic aspects of the work. The hair was long, typically, and keeping it in good condition required constant effort. Oils were worked through it, perfumed preparations were applied, herbs were used in ways that the medieval understanding of their properties suggested would help. The medieval understanding of what helped hair was partially correct and partially optimistic. Rosemary oil does have genuine properties relevant to scalp health. Certain herbal preparations had real effects. Others had effects that were different from the intended ones, or no effects at all, or effects that the modern reader, with access to a chemistry degree, would recognise as a consequence of the ingredients that the medieval apothecary would not have predicted. The combing removed lice, the combing also removed hair, and the medieval attitude toward hair loss had its own elaborate system of concern and attempted remedy. Preparations were applied to the scalp to encourage growth and prevent loss, some of which were sensible, and some of which included ingredients that raised questions. Bear fat was applied to balding areas on the grounds that the bear was a notably hairy animal, and this property might be transferred. This did not work, but the reasoning was internally consistent. For men, the relationship with hair was governed by fashion, which changed considerably across the medieval period, and by practical considerations, which changed less. The barber was a significant figure, visited regularly by men of all classes who required their hair to be cut and their beards to be managed. The barber's involvement in the lice situation was professional and constant, and was performed with the calm efficiency of someone for whom this was simply the professional context in which work was done. The beard presented its own challenges. A beard accumulated the evidence of meals in ways that required management. Medieval table manners addressed this somewhat. The beard was combed, the beard was trimmed. The beard was, in some periods and in some ranks, oiled, which improved its appearance and added another aromatic element to the already complex personal presentation of a medieval man of standing. Travel in the medieval period meant, eventually, arriving somewhere and needing somewhere to sleep. The inn was that somewhere, and the inn was an experience that medieval travellers described with a consistency that suggests it made an impression. The medieval inn provided a bed, in the loosest possible definition of that term. What it actually provided was a space in a bed, in a room with other travellers, in a building where everyone who had stopped there before you had also slept, and where the bedding had been washed with a frequency that the economics of the inn business did not encourage to be excessive. The bed at the inn was shared with strangers, people who had been travelling, which meant people who had not bathed recently, which meant people in the condition of medieval travellers, which was the condition of people who had been on the road in wool clothing for a variable number of days. They arrived. They removed their boots. The boots had been worn all day. The boots had been worn yesterday. The boots had been worn for the past several days of the journey. The room at the inn accumulated, over the course of a night, the the combined aromatic contributions of everyone in it, plus the residual contributions of everyone who had been in it before, absorbed into the rushes on the floor, and the bedding on the beds, and the walls of the room, and the general fabric of the place. Medieval travellers were not uniformly horrified by this. They were travellers in the medieval world, which meant their reference point was the conditions of the medieval world, which meant the inn was simply where you slept when you were travelling, and the conditions of the inn were the conditions of the inn. Some travellers complained. The complaints are recorded and they are illuminating. Some travellers did not complain because they had nowhere else to sleep, and complaining was not going to change the bedding. The food at the inn was cooked over a fire and eaten at a common table with whatever other travellers were present. The ale was shared. The conversation was shared. The lice almost certainly were shared, because that is what lice do when people with lice sleep in close proximity, which is what happens at inns. And then morning came, and the travellers put their boots back on, and they continued on their journeys, carrying with them the combined experience of the night, which was to say, they smelled like people who had spent the night at a medieval inn. And this was simply the condition of being a traveller in the medieval world. And here we are at the end of our long journey through the hygiene of the medieval world. We have visited the knight in his armour, which smelled of himself and his previous week, and possibly the week before that. The noblewoman arranging hair that was beautiful and elaborate and had not encountered soap recently. The great hall with its rushes and its dogs and its accumulated evidence of communal life. The garderobe and the men who managed what the garderobe produced. The city street and what it contained. The medieval bed and all its occupants. The monastery with its rules and its running water. The peasant cottage with its pig. The inn and the people who slept there. We have seen a world that was, by our standards, aromatic in ways we would not choose. We have also seen a world that was managing, always managing, with the tools available, the knowledge available, the hot water available, which was considerably less of it than we have. The medieval person was not waiting for us to arrive with our showers and our deodorant and our disposable razors and our air conditioning. They were living in their world, managing their world, doing what the world required, and not thinking particularly about the gap between their world and a world of hot running water that had not yet been invented. They used perfume and herbs and aromatic preparations with the genuine understanding that these things helped. They bathed when bathing was possible, which was less often than we bathe, but more often than the popular imagination suggests. They managed their hair and their clothing and their spaces with real skill and real effort, and the results were, by their standards, entirely adequate. They smelled. By our standards, they smelled considerably. But our standards were built on infrastructure that was not available to them. Their standards were built on what was possible in their world, and within those standards they managed. The knight finally removed his armour. The noblewoman's attendant finished the last braid. The monastery bell rang for Compline, and the monks washed their hands one last time before the great silence. The city settled into its aromatic night. The fires banked, the streets a little quieter, the smell a little gentler in the cool air. The rushes on the floor were what they were, the bed was what it was, the night smelled of everything the day had been, and they slept, as you will now, considerably cleaner than any of them, in sheets washed recently, in a room that smells of almost nothing, which is a luxury so profound and so normal that we have entirely ceased to notice it. Rest well. You smell wonderful, and they were magnificent anyway. The clothing of the medieval period deserves its own examination, because clothing was the primary interface between the medieval body and the medieval world, and that interface was doing considerable work on both sides of the equation. Medieval clothing was made from two principal materials for most people, wool and linen. Each had its own relationship with the human body wearing it, its own capacity for absorbing and retaining the evidence of that body, and its own particular smell after extended wear. Linen was worn next to the skin. The linen shirt or shift was the garment that had the most intimate contact with the body, that received the most direct output of the body, and that was, accordingly, washed more frequently than any other garment. Linen has a property that makes it particularly suited to this purpose. It can be boiled. You can submerge linen in boiling water, and it will survive the experience, emerging cleaner and not destroyed. This was not true of wool, and not true of the outer garments, and it meant that the linen undergarment was the one piece of clothing that was regularly, genuinely washed. How regularly depended on rank. A noblewoman might change her linen shift daily, or every few days. A peasant woman might change hers weekly, or when the laundry was done, or when the opportunity arose. The linen was the cleanest thing a medieval person wore, and the frequency of its changing was one of the clearest indicators of economic status in the daily experience of medieval life. Wool was worn over the linen. Wool is warm. Wool is durable. Wool is, in the medieval period, what everything substantial was made of, because it was available and it worked. Wool also absorbs. It absorbs the smell of the body inside it. It absorbs sweat. It absorbs the smells of the environment around it, because wool is porous in a way that traps and holds the aromatic history of wherever it has been. A medieval wool garment that had been worn through a winter retained, in its fibres, the record of that winter. The smoke of the fires it had sat near, the sweat of the work done in it, the rain it had been caught in and dried imperfectly from, the feast it had been worn to, where the food smell had worked its way in, the stable it had passed through, the bed it had been slept in, over the cloak in the cold night. All of this was present, layered, specific, the olfactory autobiography of a garment and the person who wore it. Wool was not washed frequently, because wool that is washed incorrectly is wool that is ruined. Hot water and aggressive treatment causes wool to felt, to shrink, to become a stiff and misshapen approximation of the garment it was. The medieval laundress knew this and was accordingly cautious. Wool was brushed. Wool was beaten to remove surface dirt. Wool was aired on hedges and fences in the hope that the weather would accomplish some of what washing would accomplish, without the risks. Wool was treated with herbs and perfumes to address the smell, which by this point was considerable, from the outside. The result was that the outer garments of medieval people, which were the garments the world saw, and by which social status was communicated, were regularly the least washed items they owned. The expensive gown that announced your rank was also the gown that had been worn at the last 6 important occasions, and carefully brushed and stored in between, accumulating through those occasions the layered record of a medieval life. The smell of a medieval crowd was the smell of wool that had been worn a great deal and washed infrequently, combined with the smell of the people inside the wool, combined with the aromatic management being applied to both, combined with whatever the immediate environment was contributing. It was a full and present smell. It was the smell of medieval Europe, and to everyone in it, it was simply the smell of being somewhere with other people, which was normal, because everywhere with people smelled like this, because this is what people smelled like. Medieval breath was an area of particular concern and considerable effort, because breath is immediately and directly perceptible to anyone within conversation range, and medieval conversations happened at a proximity that left nothing to the imagination. The medieval table, as we have discussed, offered a diet that was not particularly kind to teeth. Sugar, available to the wealthy and increasingly accessible to others, caused decay. White bread, preferred by the wealthy, was soft and sticky in ways that encouraged bacterial activity. The meat that formed the central component of any substantial meal lodged in the gaps between teeth, with a dedication that the toothpick struggled to address comprehensively. The result was that toothache was one of the most common complaints of the medieval period, that tooth loss was normal in a way that modern dentistry has made it no longer be, and that the breath of medieval people, emerging from mouths in which various interesting processes were occurring, was a feature of social life that everyone was aware of, and no one entirely escaped. The attempts to address medieval breath were numerous, creative, and of varying effectiveness. Wine was swished in the mouth after meals, partly for enjoyment and partly for its modest cleaning properties. Herbs were chewed, mint, which genuinely does freshen breath because it genuinely does have properties that address the bacteria responsible for bad breath, was used in preparations and as a chewing herb. Sage was used also with some genuine basis in its properties. The toothpick was deployed after every meal by anyone who had a toothpick, which was everyone of any means. The toothpick was a personal possession, kept about one's person, sometimes attached to a belt, alongside the knife that also went everywhere. Using the toothpick at the table was normal. It was a gesture of courtesy. In a way, a demonstration that one was attending to the situation, that one was the kind of person who maintained themselves at table, which was a statement about one's standing as much as about one's teeth. Tooth powders were rubbed onto the teeth with a cloth or a finger. Some were made of chalk, which was mildly abrasive and more or less harmless. Some contained salt, which had genuine antiseptic properties and was available. Some contained ingredients that the medieval understanding of effective tooth care suggested were appropriate, which the modern understanding of effective tooth care would question, but which were used with confidence because confidence was part of the medieval approach to all medical interventions. The effect of all this effort was a medieval breath that was somewhat managed, not modern managed, not the product of twice daily brushing with fluoride toothpaste and an annual professional cleaning, but managed to the degree that management was possible with the tools available. The person who chewed mint and used the toothpick and rubbed chalk powder on their teeth was doing what was available to do, and in doing it was demonstrating the same practical competence with limited resources that characterises the medieval approach to every hygiene challenge. The medieval kiss, which was a common form of social greeting at various levels of intimacy, was therefore an experience with a particular character. The social kiss between equals, or between a lord and a retainer, was not avoiding anything. It was simply the greeting, in the smell of the medieval world, between people who were also of the medieval world, and it landed in the context in which it was given, which was the context of medieval life. The medieval child entered a world already established in its aromatic character and joined it with the comprehensive commitment of someone who has no choice in the matter and no particular awareness that the matter is relevant. The infant was swaddled. The swaddling bands held the infant tightly wrapped, arms at its sides, legs straight, and these bands required changing when the infant's body required that they be changed, which was frequently, and the frequency with which they were changed was directly proportional to the resources available for changing them, which in poor households was not always as frequently as the ideal would suggest. The medieval infant in its swaddling bands, after some hours, had developed what we might call a particular presence. The changing of the bands was managed with whatever cloth was available, and whatever water could be heated, and whatever patience the mother had for the process in the middle of a day that also contained cooking and farming, and the care of older children, and the management of the household, and the 100 other demands that medieval life made on the people responsible for running it. The medieval child, once out of swaddling, was a creature of the floor. The floor we have already discussed at some length. The child on the floor was among the rushes, among the dogs, among the beetles and fleas, among the dropped food scraps, and the accumulated history of the great hall, or the peasant cottage, or wherever they happened to live. Their immune systems were receiving an education of remarkable comprehensiveness, which was one way to look at it. The child's hair was combed. The fine-toothed comb was applied to children's hair with the same regularity that it was applied to adults, because lice did not discriminate by age, and a child whose lice were not managed was a child who was managing lice for the entire household, because that is what lice do. The combing of children's hair was part of the daily routine, a gesture of care that was simultaneously practical and affectionate, which is not a bad combination for a daily routine. The child's clothing was managed with the care appropriate to its cost, which meant careful maintenance, infrequent washing of the outer layers, regular changing of the linen, and the general management that medieval clothing required from everyone. Children's clothing was often handed down, one child to the next, accumulating through the generations the evidence of multiple childhoods, which was efficient and economical and fragrant in its own particular way. The medieval child grew up in this world and considered it normal because it was normal. The reference point they were building was calibrated to their environment, as everyone's reference point is calibrated to their environment. And what seems extraordinary to us was to them simply the air, simply the floor, simply the smell of home. Let us do a final accounting, a summary of the aromatic experience of a single day in the medieval world, lived by a person of moderate means, somewhere in Northern Europe, in a season that is not particularly cooperative with hygiene. Morning. The sleeping chamber, which has been occupied overnight by the sleepers and the cold and the tallow candle that was left burning low against the dark smells of the night. The fire has been kept going, poorly, and the wood smoke is present. The chamber pot is in the corner. The bedding is the bedding of people who slept in it. The sleeper rises. The face is washed in the basin. The water in the basin was cold because it was not heated, because heating water for the morning face wash requires effort that the morning does not always permit. The hands are washed. The teeth are attended to with whatever tooth preparation is used. The hair is combed, which takes time, and the fine-toothed comb does its daily work. The clothing from yesterday is put on. The linen shift, which was perhaps changed this week, perhaps will be changed tomorrow. The wool overgarments, which are not changed today and were not changed yesterday, and will not be changed until the laundry day, which is some weeks away. The shoes, which have been off overnight and have had the benefit of that airing. Downstairs to the great hall, where the morning fire is being rebuilt, and the smell of yesterday's dinner still exists in the rushes, and the dogs are finding their morning positions, and the smell of the night is giving way to the smell of the morning, which is wood smoke, and yesterday, and the beginning of today. Food is prepared and eaten. Hands are washed before eating, because this is expected. The meal is shared. The dishes are shared. The cup is shared. The conversation is had at close proximity with the breath of morning and the breath of the people around you, which is simply the smell of being among people, which everyone is accustomed to. The day proceeds. Work is done. It is physical work, as most medieval work was, and it produces sweat, and the wool absorbs the sweat, and the smell of the day's work accumulates in the clothing and on the skin. The outdoor smells of the world are encountered, the street, or the field, or the stable, or the market, and they contribute to the experience of the day. Evening comes. The great hall fills again. Dinner is eaten. The dogs are under the table. The candles are lit. The fire burns. The tallow candles add their smell to the wood smoke, and the rushes and the people, and the food and the dogs. The evening is warm, relatively, in the pool of light around the fire, and warm and close in the way that medieval evenings in shared spaces were. And then the night, back to the sleeping chamber. The clothing comes off, or some of it. The bed receives its occupants. The night begins again. This was the day. This was every day for the people of the medieval world. It smelled like this, all of it, consistently and without interruption, and it was normal, and they lived in it entirely, and they fought battles and built cathedrals and wrote poetry and fell in love and cooked remarkable food and created music that survives and made things with their hands that we still find beautiful. All of it smelling like this. And perhaps that is the thing to carry with you as you drift off. Not the smell exactly, but the understanding that every era has its conditions, and the people in those conditions are simply the people of their time, managing what their time requires with what their time provides. We are also people of our time. We also manage what our time requires with what our time provides. Our time provides hot water and indoor plumbing and synthetic detergents and temperature-controlled storage for food and all the infrastructure of modern cleanliness that we never think about. Their time provided wool and herbs, and the river in summer, and the cold water in the basin in the morning, and the fine-toothed comb, and the pomander at the belt, and the rose water, and the lavender in the bedding. They managed. They always managed. Rest now. The medieval world is settling into its night. The knight is finally out of his armour, sitting by the fire, smelling of himself and the day, exactly as everyone around him smells of themselves and the day, which is to say, entirely normally, in the world they lived in. The noblewoman's hair is combed and arranged for sleep. The monks have said Compline. The city is quieter. The pigs are wherever the pigs are. The gong firmers are beginning their work. The rushes are on the floor. The candle is burning down. Sleep well. You are, by any comparative measure, remarkably clean. And they were magnificent anyway. The perfume trade of the medieval period was not a luxury industry. It was, in the most practical sense, an essential service industry, and the people who supplied it understood their market with perfect clarity, because their market was everyone who needed to function in a world that smelled like the medieval world, and preferred to smell like something else. The raw materials of medieval perfume came from extraordinary distances. Musk from the Himalayan deer, traded through intermediaries across the Silk Road. Ambergris from the ocean, found washed on beaches or floating in the sea, a substance of oceanic origin that cost more per ounce than almost anything else available. Frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, oud from the forests of Southeast Asia, civet from the civet cat of Africa. Each of these substances arrived in European markets after journeys of months or years, through multiple hands, each of which added a margin to the price. By the time these substances reached the apothecary shop in London or Paris or Cologne, they were expensive in a way that reflected every mile and every transaction of their journey. They were purchased by people who could afford them, which meant the wealthy, which meant the people who most needed to present a certain kind of personal presence and had the resources to purchase it. The perfumer's art was in combining these substances into something that worked on the skin, that lasted, that smelled intentional rather than accidental, that said to anyone in olfactory range that here was a person who had spent money on this problem. The skill was genuine, the products were real, and the need they addressed was immediate, practical, and daily. Below the luxury perfumes were the everyday aromatics. Rose water, which was made in Europe from European roses, and was therefore relatively accessible, was used by anyone who could afford any personal care beyond the basics. It was used to wash the face and hands. It was used to rinse the mouth. It was sprinkled on clothing. It was added to the bath when there was a bath. It was the rose water of the medieval world. Pleasant, present, practical, everywhere. Lavender was grown in European gardens and was available to anyone with a garden or access to a market. It was put in bedding. It was put in clothing storage. It was put in the rushes. It was burned in the room to scent the air. It was an aromatic Swiss Army knife of the medieval world, applied everywhere and expected to do everything, and it did some of it, which was enough to justify its omnipresence. Rosemary, mint, thyme, sage, chamomile, and a dozen other herbs served similar purposes in the daily management of medieval smell. They were grown, harvested, dried, and deployed in the ongoing project of making the medieval world smell better than it naturally did, and they were part of the domestic landscape of the period in a way that makes sense only when you understand what they were competing with. The person of the medieval period who walked through their day surrounded by the smell of lavender and rose water, and the wool of their clothing, and the wood smoke of their fire, and the herbs of their garden, was not living in a bad-smelling world, from within their own reference point. They were living in their world, which smelled like their world, which was the only world there was, and it smelled perfectly normal. The rest we supply from the outside, with our modern noses, and our modern reference points, and our remarkable hot showers. And we should perhaps hold those reference points lightly when we look at them. They were managing. We are also managing. The management looks different. The underlying project is the same. Rest now. The lavender is in the bedding. The rose water is in the basin. The fire is low. Sleep.